Welcome back to Every Naval Battle in History. This is episode 4, the Battle of Alalia, 535 BCE. Enter Carthage. After the Greeks entered the ledger in 664 BCE with the inter-corinthian conflict off Corfu, the next battle known to history finally leaves the eastern Mediterranean, slips through the straits of Messina, and takes place off the coast of Corsica. It's a three-fleet fight between a side hardly anyone has heard of, one most folks barely know anything about, and the super heavyweight of naval history, Carthage. The Battle of Alalia took place sometime between 540 BCE and 535. The sources are still not real precise about these things. The Phocaeans are mostly lost to history. For a while they were real naval players on the world scene. A Greek island off the coast of modern-day Turkey, they pioneered long-distance sailing routes. For a century or so, they were on a trajectory to really make it in the big leagues. The most famous of their settlements is Marseille in France. Against this plucky upstart flooding colonists into the western Mediterranean, we have the Etruscans, then the dominant power in Italy, and Carthage. Let's talk about Carthage. This episode really surprised me. It rearranged my understanding of antiquity. It goes against the narrative of high school textbooks. The narrative I'd lived with is that the big Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon in modern Lebanon got into the sea trade game, fought the Greeks frequently, and when Alexander captured them and later all of Persia, Carthage, as a big Phoenician settlement in the western Med, took over the leadership of the Phoenician world. But here in 535 BCE, before any other Phoenician naval battle has entered the historical record, we already have Carthage fighting for hegemony. We have to remember that at this time the fledgling maritime empires were setting up colonies willy-nilly around the Mediterranean shore. Our modern concepts of maps with national boundaries were utterly alien to them. What mattered were sheltered sandy beaches they could pull a ship up for the night and sources of fresh drinkable water. The big islands of the Western Med were particularly interesting to these cultures, islands being naturally defended from continental hordes, and the bigger islands having the space for agriculture and the possibility of mineral resources. Sardinia, Corsica and Sicily were huge prizes for the time, and more than capable of hosting multiple factions simultaneously. Sicily was known for centuries as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. Carthage, the word literally means new city in Phoenician, began around 800 BCE as one of a string of ports within a day's sailing of each other, stretching from Tyre to Spain, but it was on the path to greatness. Sitting at the crossroads of multiple trade routes is a powerful thing, and having rich agricultural land immediately to hand compounds imperial ambition yet again. It certainly appears that Carthage was much more aggressive and independent at this point in time, under the direction of the Maganid dynasty, than a conventional telling of the history would have you believe. The fact that the Romans and the Greeks wrote that history probably has something to do with it. Now, the Etruscans. The Etruscans make a rare impact at sea here. The dominant power in Italy for centuries, they would come off the worst to a rising power of Rome to their south in the late 4th century BCE. Talented artisans and accomplished traders with northern Europe, they had been watching the arrival of waves of Greek colonists in the western Mediterranean and reached agreement with Carthage to do something about it. Let's turn to the battle. The Phocaean fleet, protecting their settlement of Allalia on the east coast of Corsica, is said to have numbered 60 pentaconters. These are considered distinct from triremes and had 50 oars, from which their name derives, in a single bank. Some sources indicate they were more trade and transport vessels than pure warships. It's been a fuzzy line through history. But the presence of rams, with the huge penalty they bring to general seakeeping, makes them distinctly weapons of war. You don't want to hang tons of bronze on the front end of your ship unless you really have to. To give a sense of what a huge concentration of force this was for the tiny Phocaean Empire, just 40 years later in 500 BCE they contributed just 3 ships to the Battle of Lade against the Persians much closer to home. Against the 60 ships of the Greeks, Carthage and the Etruscans had 120 vessels, also described as being pentaconters, although I am sceptical that all 3 forces had identical ships and suspect this is hand-waving by historians. Details are sketchy, but by the end of the battle 20 surviving Phocaean ships had beaten off the larger fleet. It was noted that their rams were severely damaged, which indicates much ramming was done that day. These heroics were to no avail, though. The Phocaeans, in some sense refugees since the capture of their home city by the Persians in 546, abandoned Corsica to settle in Allalia, today Velia, on Sicily. Many of the Greeks were taken prisoner despite their victory, with the Carthaginians selling them into slavery, and the Etruscans publicly stoning them to death, perhaps trying to send a pointed message to the new Greek arrivals in the region. The growing conflict between the Etruscans and the Greeks would open the way for an ambitious hill settlement on the banks of the river Tiber to make its play for glory. Allalia today goes by Allalia and is the easternmost point in metropolitan France. As would often be their wont, Carthage had done badly in the battle, but retained a long-term strategic advantage and gained their strategic objectives. In this case, the Greek withdrawal from Corsica. The Greeks, of course, were about to turn their attention to the east. More battles to come. We've got a lot of ground to cover as we take on every naval battle in history.